How do you understand or explain how Eritrea rather went from the kind of joyous moment of 1991, a moment of great optimism, to where it is today, a day of considerably more despair?
I think the real turning point was the Eritrean-Ethiopian border war. And essentially what happens is the border war triggers a set of transformations that fundamentally change, the change and sort of positive evaluation many had of the country. Mm-hmm. So what were those transformations? Well, first, the border war opened up a very serious rift within the ruling party. And so there was a very direct challenge to President Isaias Afewerki. And I think as a response to his political vulnerability, you saw a clear authoritarian shift where he cracked down on his opponents within the party and then cracked down on society more generally, because his opponents within the party had sought to mobilize support beyond the party and society more generally. And there were other important transformations that sort of followed this. Consequence of national service, and again, the architecture of this system is complex. It has both civilian and military components, has been the outmigration of Eritreans. And we're not exactly sure how many Eritreans have left, but it's a large number, perhaps in the neighborhood of 350,000 since 2002.
So can you tell me about the role that the Eritrean diaspora has played in this history of transformation?
The Eritrean diaspora, as sort of a political actor, really has its beginnings in the out-migration of Eritreans in 1967. So the Eritrean diaspora is an old one, although it didn't really reach its full strength politically, I think, until the 1980s. The Eritrean nationalist fronts, particularly the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which would go on to be the main agent of Eritrean nationalism, was put into a situation where it wasn't really able to acquire much external support from states. There were some internal political things that happened within the EPLF in 1975, 1976. So in order to fund liberation struggle, they had to reach out to this diaspora and actually build organizational links within the diaspora. And this is what they did.
What is it about? Is it something about are we misunderstanding the nature of the conflict, or are we misunderstanding the rationality as the actors on the ground understand their interests, to misunderstand why that deal seems to be so?
I think there's a couple issues at play here, and I think one, and one could, and I think these are general issues that affect sort of implementing negotiated settlements more generally, and that is, on the Ethiopian side, there really isn't a belief that if they hand Badame back directly to Eritrea, that it will sort of lead to this improvement in our relations, particularly normalization of relations. And so now this is a problem because if it doesn't lead to a normalization of relations, the ruling party, the EPRDF, in particular the TPLF, which is sort of the key player within the EPRDF, will catch a lot of fire from its constituency within Tigray. I mean, the idea of handing back Badame to Eritrea is not popular in Tigray. It's still a very emotional issue in Tigray. And if that's done and it doesn't lead to an improvement in relations with Eritrea, if it doesn't lead to tangible progress in terms of some sort of port access, if it doesn't lead to the expulsion of Ethiopian opposition that's backed by Eritrea, I mean, there's going to be a political problem for the TPLF. But the Eritreans also have their own perspective, and that is that if we do concede Ethiopia's argument, which is in order to give back Badame, we have to have we should talk about we should have dialogue and implementation. We should have some normalization of relations, talks on that. If they concede that argument, I think the fear is that they will be put into a very difficult set of negotiations with very little leverage about the total future of Eritrean-Ethiopian relations. And what that would mean essentially is that they won't have a lot of bargaining power, right? Because they'll be negotiating over ports when Ethiopia has this leverage of Badame in their back pockets, and that's not a place where they want to be in.
How does those images continue to shape Eritrean politics and Eritrean popular understanding of who they are and maybe even what their future is.
I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one, of course, I mean, it's a great story, right? I mean, it was a great achievement. 30-year liberation struggle, cost 60,000 lives, 1/4 of Eritrea's population displaced. The opponent was backed by 2 superpowers, so a great story, legitimately. And what it's become now, and I think this is perhaps a bit more problematic, is that I think it's become a key tool of legitimation for the government. The confidence that Eritrea projects on the international stage, I think, in part is a legacy of the struggle, right? And the achievement of independence against all odds.
All right. So I'm asking about the importance of Badame as a cause for all of this war and suffering.
The Eritrean-Ethiopian War wasn't really necessarily just about borders, right? That was part of it. I mean, Badame was really the end of a string of altercations between Eritrea and Ethiopia over their relations as independent countries. And it was a culmination of a set of altercations that would then lead to war, right? I mean, you can't look at Badame in isolation, right? There were a number of things that happened before that that really soured relations between the two erstwhile allies in Eritrea and Ethiopia, the EPLF and TPLF. One issue, this is a big one, was trade, right? And in particular, the harmonization agenda between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Eritrea used the Ethiopian birr, and I think there was a fundamental question there about who controlled the harmonization agenda. What would the economic status of Eritrea be within Ethiopia? Eritreans accused the TPLF of protectionism when Eritrea introduced the Nakfa, saying that all trade need to happen in hard currency, which shut a lot of Eritrean traders and businessmen out of Ethiopia. So things were bad by the time Badame rolls around. But I think I would say that look, I mean, partition is not easy, right? When you have a divorce, there's a certain amount of inbuilt tension. There's issues you have to resolve, right? About the status between the divorced parties going forward, how you divide assets. And I don't think people within the EPLF and the TPLF really recognize the tensions that would emerge. What happens in Badame is there had been a string of, I guess you could call them engagements or sort of events on the border. The Eritreans say that there were a number of Ethiopian incursions. The Ethiopians say the reverse. But essentially what happens in Badame is there's a meeting there's a sort of conflict event between Eritrean and Ethiopian security forces in Badame, and a couple of Eritrean officers are killed. The Eritreans respond by using full force and seizing all the disputed territorial.
It's interesting that we've gone from a kind of a state explanation of what state interests are to a kind of an organizational EPLF, TPLF, kind of different legacies coming out of the struggle. There's a third explanation that I often hear that gets down to very individual level explanations. It is about a fight between Isaias and Meles Zenawi, two remarkable individuals, two of the individuals that kind of created the Horn of Africa as we know it today. But how much can we understand these larger state struggles as a struggle between those two individuals?
There is a grain of truth, right? I mean, I think Eritrean and Ethiopian relations in the 1990s and the quality of those relations in many sense hinged on the sort of personal relations between the leaders of the EPLF and TPLF, Meles and Isaias in particular. And when those relations began to fray, in large part because of the heat Meles was getting from people within his own party in Ethiopia more generally, it's sort of the need to recalibrate relations between the two countries. There was nothing, I think, left really institutional to fall back on, and to sort of maintain a peaceful status quo between the two countries. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that mattered, right? Perhaps relations between the two countries were too personalized, too deinstitutionalized.
I remember back in the 1980s, the EPLF during the time of the struggle had an amazing international diplomatic effort, both through the diaspora and in Washington. You saw EPLF everywhere trying to tell its stories, trying to build up alliances, trying to explain what it was that the then Derg regime was doing, where Eritrean diplomacy today seems to be in some ways the exact opposite. Some people say that the Eritreans never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
There was a strategic choice, I think, made in Eritrea within the government at about around 2004, where Eritrea recognized that the international community, and the United States in particular, was not going to pressure Ethiopia to fulfill its obligations under the Algiers Accord, namely to return Badame, demarcate the border and return Badame back to Eritrea without any sort of preconditions or quid pro quo. And once I think that determination was made, the Eritreans decide to make noise internationally to sort of put this issue on the agenda, get it noticed, and get some action on it. And so I think you can understand Eritrea's bad behavior and sort of bad diplomacy as not necessarily cultural or a struggle of some sort of past legacy, but really as a result of a strategic decision. And so you see, some of the anti-American rhetoric you saw, the diplomatic restrictions placed on the United States, the restrictions placed on UNMI. Yes. A lot of this was deliberate strategy. And from an Eritrean perspective, it makes, on some level, some sense, right? If no one notices there's a problem, you have to create more problems, so they notice it, right? Yeah. And I think you can interpret Eritrea's, I don't think it was robust involvement, but certainly some involvement in Somalia. I think it was part of this broader strategy of drawing attention to Ethiopia's non-implementation.
So where does this story head next, do you think? Is it likely to remain the kind of highly militarized society and government that it is today, or must it reach a breaking point and reach a fork in the road that goes one way or the other in the near to medium term?
I'm probably more positive now than I've been in a long time about the potential for change in Eritrea and about sort of Eritrea's political and economic future. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, I think there's some clear indications that really come out in the last few months that the government may begin a process of managed political reform where they, maybe it's not full political liberalization, in fact it most certainly won't be, but there will be a certain amount of space opened up. Maybe not for sort of open political discourse, but some of the government's more repressive, egregious behavior, I think, will perhaps be minimized.
What are the signs that you're seeing that lead you to
well, one, I think, is the president's recent announcement of a constitution, and this came at his most recent Independence Day speech. The president said that he will shortly begin a process for drafting a new Eritrean constitution. A lot of people are rightly skeptical because Eritrea already has a constitution that's unimplemented, and a lot of people suspect that the president and his allies may be simply writing a new constitution to permanently entrench themselves in power, right? To legalize and legitimize the authoritarian regime. I think there's certainly, I mean, I think it is an olive branch, right? I mean, the government doesn't really do democratic pretense, right? I mean, if they say, if they say we're going to implement a constitution, I think it does mean a certain, that there may be a political shift, right? Both in tone and rhetoric, but also in practice. And so that's good, but no, I don't see Eritrea being a Jeffersonian democracy anytime in the near future. But Eritreans just want a basic level of relief. I mean, things have been difficult in the past 12 years. So any kind of reform on the political front, I think, will be celebrated by many people in Eritrea. The economic picture is still difficult, in part because Eritrean society is still totally militarized, right? So access to labor is very difficult. That has an effect on the private sector and investment. There still are very big resource challenges. The mining sector has been a great resource. I mean, has been great for the overall economic picture, particularly the macroeconomic picture. But and that's good, But And so, look, I mean, Eritrea's economy basically stagnated between 2002 and 2010. International relations, I think there are also some pretty clear signs that Eritrea wants to fix its broken international relations. It left the AU and IGAD in protest, has got back into the AU, is trying now to re-enter IGAD. We'll see how successful they are on that front. They are now talking with several European countries about improving, expanding the bilateral donor relationship.
Is there a change in the diaspora relationship as well that might give us reason to think that some better days are ahead?
And there is more of a willingness now, I think, to call the Eritrean government to account within the diaspora. I think one great example of this would be the Lampedusa, Lampedusa, where which was essentially an event last year where 350 Eritrean migrants died on a boat in the Mediterranean. And I think it really highlighted for Eritreans the problems that the total militarization of Eritrean society has produced, right? The costs of that militarization, and really demanded, I mean, so there was the first issue was whether the bodies would be returned, and a lot of people suspected that the government wouldn't want the bodies to return because there would be a process of very public grieving, perhaps political grieving, and well, it's political, of course, within Eritrea. But the government, frankly, I think initially sort of ignored what happened at Lampedusa, and then was forced to issue a public statement and make real tangible efforts to get the bodies returned. And they did this because the diaspora exploded, right? It became a very emotional issue. So I think, you know, so when I say I feel a little better about Eritrea's political future, I mean, again, I don't think, I don't think
it's not going to be Denmark.
No, it's not. It's not going to be Denmark. But I do think that the willingness of folks in the diaspora, which is the traditional power base for the government, to actually speak out and challenge the government is a positive sign.
Why the trend may be heading in a direction that's much more encouraging in a moment that's really quite discouraging.
Yeah.
That you do begin to see out of that perhaps
right.
the beginnings of a new...
Right, and I would even, just to point out one other, and I'll leave it at this, I mean, one other reason I think cause for optimism is that some of the government's more egregious human rights abuses that we saw after the 2001 purge, particularly when it comes to the roundup of national service conscripts, you know, some of that has actually, I mean, there obviously are still very problematic human rights abuses, but I don't think it's as egregious as it once was. I mean, there was, Human Rights Watch talked about this, a shoot-to-kill policy at the border for people, for national service conscripts that were leaving the country. I don't think that's in effect anymore. I haven't heard a lot recent evidence of that. So I think the government has learned to moderate some of its more abusive practices of domination. And that's also a positive sign, right? It's all relative, right? Yeah.